There he is, he who once shone like a star and is now a mere shadow of himself. There he is, the majestic king who once ruled Thebes, the mortal who defeated the Sphinx with its inscrutable riddles. Oedipus, the parricide, the incestuous, he whom all of Greece revered for his wisdom, but who was nothing but an indecipherable enigma to himself. Banished, doomed to exile, he wanders. Only Antigone, his elder daughter, remains by his side. Antigone. She is both austere and sad. She holds her head high, impervious to insults that come their way. They walk together, the chaste girl guiding the blind man. And to anyone who sees them, he seems more like a ghost who has returned from the underworld. The high priestess of Delphi had prophesied for Oedipus the cruelest of fates. You will kill your father and sleep with your mother. All of his life, he who would become king of Thebes had tried to prove the oracle wrong. But in the end, the truth was brought to light. Oedipus had indeed, without knowing it, murdered his father and then married his mother. From this incestuous union, 4 children would be born. 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. When this appalling truth was revealed to Jocasta, his unfortunate mother who had since become his wife, she hanged herself. In his despair, Oedipus then seized the gold pins that adorned his mother's dress and gouged out his eyes. He would never again see the day or the night, or his fellow human beings. The throne of Thebes was now vacant. Since Oedipus's sons Eteocles and Polynices were too young to rule, it was Creon, their uncle, who served as regent. Creon decided not to punish Oedipus because he felt that he had already paid enough for his crimes by depriving himself of the light of day. This decision outraged both Eteocles and Polynices. The 2 adolescent boys, who were as proud as they were belligerent, were furious that their names had been disgraced. They seized Oedipus and locked him up in a prison in the palace. Even worse, they went on to pronounce their father's abdication and claim the throne for themselves. To their father's sorrow and shame was thus added betrayal. Oedipus warned his sons, if they no longer honored their father, if they defied fate and the gods by humiliating the man who gave them life, they would end up dividing their kingdom by the sword. Eteocles and Polynices took no heed of their father's curse. Instead, they went even further and expelled him from Thebes. Ever since that day, supported by his daughter and draped in his sorrow as if it were a shroud, Oedipus had wandered the land. As they made their way, the girl could be seen holding up the old man as if he were a hero. She knew from a very young age that one should never give in, never yield to the blows of fate. Finally, not far from Athens, in their weariness, they stopped at the entrance to a small town called Colonus. An oracle had once told Oedipus that this was where he would find some rest. They were offered shelter at last. Oedipus was worn to the bone. Antigone lay down by his side and put her arms around him, as if the father had suddenly become the child. A year went by, far from the tumult and the clamor that reached their ears from Thebes. Early one morning, at the first light of dawn, there came a knock at the door. It was Ismene, Antigone's sister. She was very agitated. In a rush of words, she told them about the latest turn of events in Thebes. Eteocles and Polynices had ascended to the throne, but their triumph was marred by their father's warning. Hadn't he, Oedipus, their father, predicted that their kingdom would be divided by the sword? In order to prevent such a curse from coming true, Eteocles came up with a plan. They would share their rule. As a way of avoiding any conflict, each brother would reign for 1 year, and then they would switch. Polynices agreed. Eteocles, being the older of the two, would be the first to sit on the throne, with the promise that he would step down when his time was up. Polynices respected their agreement, and he thought it would be better for him to remain away from Thebes during his brother's reign. He went to the nearby city of Argos, which was under the rule of King Adrastus. He married the king's daughter. And thus the ties between Thebes, the city of Dionysus, and Argos, the city of the great hero Perseus, were officially reinforced. When the first year was over, Polynices returned to Thebes to claim his right to the royal scepter. Alas, power is like a drug that goes to the head. Eteocles refused to honor their agreement. He scoffed at their vow. To save his skin, Polynices had no choice but to flee. His brother's soldiers were already on their way to arrest him and throw him in a dungeon. Ismene took a short breath. Her heart quickened, and she tried to calm herself down before she returned to her story. Polynices galloped at full speed back to the city of Argos. Once there, he went straight to Adrastus and appealed to him for help. The king gave him an army led by 7 valiant captains. He set out for Thebes to reclaim his due. These captains were known as the 7 against Thebes. At the head of these warriors, Polynices vowed to destroy the walls of the city and kill the brother who had betrayed him. Ismene paused and then murmured, "Unless our father Oedipus agrees to come back and offer his support to one of the 2 brothers, the one whom he believes is most worthy to reign." The blind man shook his head feebly. "No, he would not go. Let his sons fulfill their own destiny. Burdened by the weight of his terrible deeds, filled with despair, Oedipus no longer felt he had the strength or the moral authority to intervene in human affairs. Full of sorrow and remorse, he had nothing more to live for. Suddenly, an enormous chasm opened up. And as Antigone and Ismene looked on in astonishment, their poor father slowly disappeared down to the land of the dead. Zeus had decided to put an end to his suffering. Ismene burst into tears. Antigone remained impassive. She took her sister by the hand. It was time to go back to Thebes. As Antigone approached the city, a terrifying sight greeted her eyes. A huge army was encamped outside its walls. It was Polynices' army. 7 chiefs were stationed at each of the 7 gates of the mighty city of Thebes. They were surrounded by an ocean of glittering shields, crested helmets, and a forest of spears. Antigone rushed up to Polynices. She tried to reason with him. She begged him not to take up arms against his brother. Polynices refused. He had been wronged, denied his rightful due. Eteocles must pay and give back the throne. Antigone then ran to the palace where Eteocles had barricaded himself and implored him not to fight. Eteocles too refused. It was out of the question that he, the elder son, would give up his throne. War between the 2 brothers was inevitable. And Antigone was powerless to stop them. She climbed up to the top of the highest wall in Thebes, and there, in a night of silence and fear, in which every little sound made her heart stand still, she waited for the world to go up in flames. The sun was beginning to glow on the horizon. Dawn was breaking over Thebes. With a heavy heart, Antigone looked out upon a scene that was like a promise of death. The 2 armies hurled themselves at each other. Their flamboyant crests and golden suits of armor were soon engulfed in the fray. Time and time again, Polynices and his troops launched their assault on the city. In vain. The walls of Thebes were impregnable. The hostilities, the shouting, the fury of the battle went on for hours, and still there was no victor. Then, as night was falling, Polynices detached himself from the ranks of the attackers. He offered to meet his brother in single combat. Eteocles accepted. They had to stop the fighting. Like 2 wild beasts, the brothers rushed at each other. They leapt, they dodged, they smote. And then suddenly, Polynices fell to the ground. The victor was Eteocles. He turned towards his soldiers and was lifting his arms up in triumph when Polynices raised himself up and with his last breath thrust his sword into his brother's back. it was over. The sons of Oedipus lay side by side in the dust. The two brothers had slain each other. Antigone could no longer hold back her tears. She wept. She wept for the terrible fate that afflicted her family. Preparations had to be made for the funeral. Creon came forward. It was he who was once again sitting on the throne of Thebes. Creon wanted to believe in a new era, in a new world. And he intended to found this new world on principles that would be inviolable. He was determined to do everything he could to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. To begin with, he decided to honor the hero who died defending the city of Thebes, Eteocles. He had Eteocles buried with great pomp and ceremony. Secondly, he ordered Polynices' body to be left out on the battlefield. Let him be fed to the dogs. That way, everyone would know the price to be paid for bearing arms against the city. Creon was inflicting on Polynices what the Greeks considered to be the most dreadful punishment of all. Denying someone the right to a proper burial, depriving them of the offerings and rites that are due to the dead, was to doom that person's soul to wander forever without rest in the underworld. For Creon, this was not a light-hearted decision. He had nothing against his nephew Polynices. But Polynices was the one who had dared to attack their home city, and this was something that could not be permitted. Creon's law was clear. Anyone who threatened Thebes, anyone who went against what he called the interests of the state, would meet with the same fate as Polynices. Antigone was outraged. She threw herself at Creon's feet. She begged him to reconsider his decision. She knew that Eteocles was a usurper, but she also knew that he had defended his city. She knew that Polynices should not have taken up arms against his own city, not even to claim what was indeed his right. But to doom a man to hell was something that she could not accept. No human being had the power to make such a decision, only the gods. Everyone was equal in the face of death. And honoring the dead, regardless of their crimes, with the proper funeral rites was a sacred duty, a duty to the gods. Creon refused to listen. He did not want any more unrest. If his people and his city were to survive, he had no choice but to strike fear into their minds. Polynices would be a symbol. Antigone stood up. She looked Creon in the eye, and she said, "No. No, I cannot accept that law. It is not Zeus's law, it is Creon's law. The law of a man, not the law of a god. As a man and as king, it is in Creon's power to govern the citizens of his city as he wishes when they are alive, but he has no authority to dispose of their souls when they are dead." There is a law that is higher than any human law. It is an unwritten law. While the gods may have allowed Polynices to be defeated, they did not want his soul to be doomed to wander forever. Antigone immediately went to see her sister. She asked Ismene to help her. In secret, under the cover of night, they would slip outside the walls of Thebes. They would look for Polynices' body and then give him the funeral rites so that he would not have to wander eternally among the shades. But Ismene refused. She was terrified. After all, they were women, and therefore subject to the laws imposed by men. Ismene reminded Antigone of the grim fate that awaited her if she were to violate this law. Antigone knew she would have to do it on her own. Darkness had settled over the plain. The night was silent. Antigone searched for Polynices' body by the light of the stars. Then she saw him at the foot of a tree, lying on his back as if he had been quartered. She began very quietly to sing a song of mourning. Then, after she had performed all of the sacred rituals, she covered his body with dirt. Antigone had done her duty. She had barely finished when the guards arrived. They grabbed her and took her straight to the palace. Antigone did not resist. She had acted with full knowledge of the consequences, and she knew what awaited her. The young woman stood before Creon. His gaze was severe, but she held her head up. Creon was deeply troubled. He wished he had never decreed his new law. But since he had declared that the worst punishment of all would be meted out to anyone who dared to go against this law, Antigone must die. Not one of the guards dared to lay a hand on her. They were all impressed by her resolve. It was she who walked before them. The citizens of Thebes looked on in dismay as Antigone made her way through the city to the steps of a tomb. It was the tomb of the Labdacides family, her family. Without any show of emotion, she entered the vault. At first, the guards hesitated. Then they rolled the stone up against the entrance. The tomb was sealed. There was nothing left for Antigone but to await the release of death. Thus did Antigone die, immured, alive, for obeying a principle that is higher than any law: morality. For the first time ever, someone had the courage to stand up to absolute power. Antigone, a pioneering figure of revolt, of disobedience in the name of conscience, paid for her incredible audacity with her life. Nothing would be the same on earth anymore. The laws of the gods as well as the laws of the state could now be opposed by the ethics of personal conscience. It was the birth of individual freedom. The age of myth would slowly come to an end. The age of history could now begin.